This is a production of O'Brien Communications.
Hi, I'm Tim O'Brien. This is the Shaping Opinion podcast. Our guest today is David McGarry. He's a research director at an organization called the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. He's a pundit and a frequent contributor to magazines and news sites on a wide range of topics. He usually writes about things tied to technology, government accountability, and consumer impact. Lately, he's been weighing in on a new law in Europe that seems targeted towards American companies and Americans online. It's called the Digital Services Act, or the DSA. The DSA was enacted in 2022, but it just went into effect. It seeks to regulate online platforms by addressing illegal content, including hate speech and disinformation. How do you define hate speech and disinformation? That's one of the things we'll be talking about today. The DSA applies to tech sites that have more than 45 million followers in Europe. These sites include Twitter or X, Meta, that's Facebook, or Google, and many others. It requires them to conduct more comprehensive content moderation, transparency in algorithms, and user tools to flag harmful content. Companies that don't comply can be fined up to 6% of their global revenue, or they may face bans in Europe. David, thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Timmy, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, where are you right now? Are you in the Washington, D.C. metro area right now?
I am in the swampland of DC, and unfortunately, the swampland doesn't just refer to the terrain. It's also quite humid out at the moment.
No, that's why I asked about that. Now, what do you do to beat the heat when you're down there in Washington?
Get inside and into the air conditioning as fast as possible is about the best that we can do.
Yeah, and it makes sense why they always go on vacation. The Senate adjourns and everything this time of year, going back to the days of before air conditioning. I have some basic questions because you're a young guy, but you've written on some very heavy topics and you've followed some very heavy topics. How did you get to this point in your career where you're doing the kind of work that you are doing?
I think there is there's an assumption about tech policy generally, which is very concerning to me, and it's something that drew me to writing analysis about tech policy into researching the issue. And namely, that is, there are certain people who seem to assume that the digital world plays by different rules. That is, for us Americans, we can regulate the digital world, these people assume, in a way that doesn't necessarily adhere to the same constitutional restrictions that we might find in the quote unquote physical world, or on the economic side, that we can regulate in a way that interferes much more with the operations of the digital economy in a way that most people would, or at least many people would think is unwise in the larger economy. I think this stems mostly from misconceptions about the technological factors that are at play on the internet. And for someone like myself, who is very interested both in politics and also in economics, going online and seeing or looking at the internet and seeing some of these misconceptions and some of these really quite blatant misunderstandings makes me want to explain exactly how the same principles that we apply to the quote unquote physical world apply to the digital world. And actually, if I can add one more thing, I think that the distinctions between the quote unquote digital world and the quote unquote physical world are vastly overstated. It's all one thing, right? Americans live their lives partially online, partially in their offline experiences. And the more that we separate these things out, we build for ourselves a permission structure to treat the two differently in a way that is quite pernicious and quite dangerous to civil liberties and free speech.
I think you pretty much summed up, and it explains for anybody that might have read anything that you've written or things that you've spoken about, that is very good context because it frames the whole discussion that we're going to have today. The focus that I wanted to have on our conversation is something that you wrote about recently and you've commented on, and that is the Digital Services Act or is it the Digital Service Act? It's the digital DSA is what they call it for short in the EU. And it's something that's been around, but it just took effect in a big way just this month in July in Europe. And the concern in America is that it could have an effect on Americans very directly in their use of the internet, and they may not even realize it. It's not something they voted for. It's not something that was run by them in a sense because it's a European thing, but it could dictate the internet as people know it in America and around the world. So could you explain what the Digital Services Act is?
Sure. So the Digital Services Act is a very large, sprawling regulation that regulates internet services that operate in the European Union, irrespective of whether or not they are European companies. So, for example, some of the heaviest burdens fall on American companies like Microsoft, Apple, Google, Meta, etc. And there are many provisions in the DSA, but I'd like to focus on a few. The first is that it more or less deputizes these online platforms to restrict content that is considered illegal. And I'd actually like to read a little bit from the DSA's preamble when they're talking about what illegal content is. So there's certain things that you might say are truly problematic. There's sorts of things that are illegal to say in the United States. Imminent causes for lawless action. We're talking about the Brandenburg Principle, et cetera. But the European Union has standards of illegal speech that apply to things like quote unquote hate speech. They also apply some of these things to misinformation, and this is very problematic for free speech generally, because of course once you allow the state to insert itself into arguments over what is true, or arguments over what is good policy, even at the margins, that creates a principle essentially that the government is the arbiter of truth, and that creates the opportunity for the government then to intrude upon the free speech of individuals, and to intrude upon conversations between individuals and shut down certain viewpoints, which may or may not prove to have some sort of validity. But it's all very arbitrary. It's all very discretionary. We see from history that it's very difficult for people, being the flawed people with flawed reasoning that we are, to simply draw a line and say, okay, we can identify 2 or 3 sorts of positions that are very, very bad, and to go no further. There are two approaches to this. You have the European approach, which is to say that the government should actually get involved and sort of muddle its way through and censor people. And then there's the American approach that says that the Nazis are allowed to march through Skokie, and there's certain types of speech that we consider lawful but awful. We have strong cultural norms against. We have strong cultural disincentives towards expressing certain viewpoints and towards the people who hold certain viewpoints. Again, the prime example being honest to goodness Nazism, which is a good thing. We don't want a society that is tolerant of genocidal ideologies. However, we also recognize that the correct arbiter and sort of the correct umpire in these sorts of disputes that involve speech and that involve conscience, again, is not the government. That is something to be dealt with by civil society and to be dealt with by individuals. The cure for bad speech is more speech. To the extent that it is proper for certain of these fringe ideologies and viewpoints to be suppressed, it should be done again from a cultural. It should be done by cultural institutions, not by the government, not by the police.
You know, there's a Supreme Court case. There's so many on the First Amendment and free speech, and there's one case that you just reminded me of, and I wanted to kind of summarize it because I think it feeds this discussion. You said lawful but awful, and the case is the Westboro Baptist Church, and I'll give the background for people that may not know about the case and the issue. There was this group from the Westboro Baptist Church that would go off and protest at the funerals of soldiers who fought and died for the United States overseas. They were against the wars. They were against whatever the causes were behind the wars or the people behind the wars. Whatever their issue was, their tactic was to go to these funerals of these family, where the family members were, and they would protest. And you had groups then, you had veteran groups and motorcycle groups that would kind of provide a buffer zone between the funeral service and these protesters. Well, that case ended up going to the Supreme Court. And the issue was, should these people have the right to go off and literally their signs, their chants, their comments to family members of someone who just died were just awful, as you said. They were the most unbelievably non-compassionate thing you could ever say to a person whose child just died in war. And yet, the Supreme Court took the position that their free speech was allowed under the First Amendment. So it did protect that, lawful but awful. And I think that's probably the extreme version of what we're talking about here. It's not speech that we like. It's not speech that we approve of as a society. But it is protected, because if it's not protected, then the questions all come back to the ones you already talked about. Who gets to set the standard on what is and what is not acceptable? Are you familiar with that case, that Westboro Baptist Church case, and or how that might apply to what the Digital Service Act is and other things in the United States?
That's entirely correct. The activities in the speech of the Westboro Baptist Church were nothing short of vile. But I think there's an insight from our founders that is very helpful here. One thing that one gets from reading the writings of people like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson or James Madison is that the principles established in politics matter a great deal. We need certain standards that will shape how we treat certain types of, or I should say, certain rights, certain governmental structures. And there's a great line from Madison when he's talking about the American Revolution, and he says that the colonists in the 1770s did not wait for the principle of taxation without consent to metastasize in all sorts of into all sorts of bad consequences. They denied the principle from the first, and they stood up against the principle. And I think the same applies to speech. If you establish the principle that the government can get involved in speech in certain ways, you are practically inviting all sorts of bad consequences down the road. And there's another interesting letter from Jefferson, which I was actually just reading yesterday, that struck me along these same lines, where he says, when you break a principle the first time, it's almost inevitable that you will get second and third instances of that principle being broken. Again, it's very difficult for us as people to say, we have a principle, we're going to fudge it here and there. But of course, nothing ever bad will come of it, because we'll be able to exert the good judgment to only break it in the right circumstances. The fact is, it is much safer for civil liberties. It's much safer for people who truly value the rights to free speech and free conscience to simply say that the government does not get involved in any of these disputes, again, short of incitement to imminent lawless action, defamation, and a few very limited exceptions, which we can argue are endangering other rights of other people. But essentially, as long as speech is not endangering the rights of others in those very extreme cases, there is no place for the government to involve itself in public debate.
Don't you think this is a battle not only between legal issues and even rights, but human nature and intent? Because, and I'm not going to, get into a conspiracy theory here right now on what people are trying to achieve. Not, although there are some things I do want to talk about sort of along those lines. But right now, when I think of human nature, I think, why do people accept certain laws, certain things that happen, and then it never goes away? Case in point, when the government introduces a funding program and they say, this is just temporary. This is just something we're going to do now. or even in human rights issues when we've seen it in Canada with the MAID program, euthanasia, where they basically say this is just for terminal ill people, and before you know it, health insurers up there, because it's nationalized health insurance, all of a sudden, to save the government money, people start qualifying for assisted suicide who are not terminally ill. And before you know it, there's the coercion issue. So you have this human nature that says, oh yeah, that'll never happen. That's just for terminally ill people. And next thing you know, you have these people who are being pressured to do that. Or you talk about funding programs like in the government, this is just temporary, this is going to go away. Or, we have the immigration issue where people say, well, we're going to give amnesty to these people, but we're going to stop right here. And we've seen that the government never does that. Once a program's enacted, it's permanent. And once things happen, it sets a precedent for future similar actions. So tax raises become more tax raises. So those kinds of things. So when we talk about speech and we talk about things that are sort of restrictive on speech, don't you think it's a battle between human nature where we say, oh, this is just for hate speech? And yet they're kind of nebulous about how they define hate speech, because it is a slippery slope, isn't it?
The impulse of human nature at play here is the desire to stop bad or uncomfortable things from occurring, and this makes a lot of sense from a evolutionary perspective. In our little bands of society, in our families or in our friend groups, if there's something going on that we don't like, we have the impulse to want to do something to stop it, and that's all well and good in the microcosm. But when we scale this up to the level of the state, it has some very dangerous consequences, because as we all know, there are plenty of types of misbehavior that the government shouldn't get involved in. I mean, I don't think that anybody would necessarily say that adultery is a good thing, or that adultery is anything but a bad thing. But also, very few people would say that adultery should be criminalized, because again, we have recognized over the course of history that there are certain parts of people's private lives, and even to a certain extent parts of people's public lives, in which the state should not involve itself. And again, this brings the very important distinction between government and civil society. There are certain things that the state should not be involved with, even certain very important things. And again, the responsibility for I guess I don't want to say policing in civil society, because the law enforcement is a government function, but the responsibility for guiding people towards the right decisions and guiding them away from the wrong decisions is something that is the responsible of individuals, of their families, of the little platoons of society. And the collapse of this distinction is the collapse of this distinction, and the result that the government becomes involved in every part of everyone's lives, that there's no barriers that the government cannot cross, is really it all comes down to the road towards authoritarianism. Because if there's no sphere of liberty for individuals to make choices on their own, from their own judgment and within the context of their own communities, you essentially are handing a blank check to the government for pervasive regulation and pervasive interference in a way that history tells us will lead straight towards a very large state and very little freedom.
Well, that's a great setup for what I was going to want to talk to you about now, because we're talking about Europe and America, and the Digital Services Act by design does blur the lines between Europe and America. So we are not talking about something that's just on the other side of the Atlantic from the United States. Because of the internet, it crosses the Atlantic in nanoseconds, the issues. So I wanted to talk first about free speech in Europe. Now, they don't have a First Amendment in any of the European countries. And we know that. We're reminded of that by our European friends all the time. they have a certain sense of free speech in places like the Great Britain and the UK and in other countries in Europe. But there are times when they remind us that they can police speech in Europe because they don't have a First Amendment. How would you characterize the regulatory environment or the free speech environment in Europe?
Europe has never been nearly as friendly towards free speech as has America. In fact, we've been pulling Europe towards free speech ever since the Peter Zenger trial back in the 18th century. There's a great line in Montesquieu where he says that free speech is the freedom of the individual to say whatever he wants as long as it is not against the law. And this standard is simply not good enough for Americans. We have decided that free speech is a fundamental part of the right of the individual to reason through ideas and to consider facts and to make decisions about what is true, what is false, what is good, what is bad in a context without state interference. And even offline, and again, this gets back to something I was saying at the beginning about the distinctions between on and offline speech. Even offline, Europe has been very bad about free speech for quite a while. This is not new. This stretches back. Europe, as you said, has never had a First Amendment, and they have always been far more comfortable on the continent with restrictions on offline speech and with criminalizing the sorts of speech that we would never dream of criminalizing here in the States. And this is translated to their online regulation with the DSA, but also elsewhere, where you have people being either questioned or worse by police for what we would generally consider either to be completely unremarkable speech or for lawful but awful speech or for misinformation, etc. The really concerning thing is that with the rise of the internet, there are actually people in both parties here in America who have begun to think that European style regulation is something that is necessary to make the internet safe. There are people who think that the internet is sort of a, shall we say, an engine of misinformation or an engine of hate speech, or an engine just of people saying objectionable things. And that the only response to that is to have the government involve itself either by suppressing certain speech by individuals or by telling online platforms how they must moderate speech and what sort of speech they must present, promote, discourage, etc. And again, one of the fundamental, both, I guess I would say one of the most fundamental things about the American experiment, but also one of the fundamental deviations of the American experiment from the old world is this notion of nearly unlimited free speech, with a couple exceptions that I mentioned before. And so American efforts to import European-style regulation are really a step back. It's a step away from what makes this country exceptional. And I would argue it is also an effort to tear down some of the things that have proven in our history to make this country strong.
If I were to play devil's advocate right now, and this is probably what you hear most from people that aren't closely following issues like this, that is, you say, well, the government shouldn't be involved in policing hate speech or misinformation. And the answer when I have these conversations is, well, aren't you against hate speech? Or aren't you against misinformation? Why shouldn't the government do it? If you're not doing hate speech, you shouldn't have a concern. Or if you're not spreading misinformation, you shouldn't have a concern. What's your answer to that?
Well, I'll give two. One is specifically concerning the technologies involved on the internet, and then the other will be a more general comment. So first about the technology. Every time there's a technological revolution in communications, people tend to become concerned that it will be misused. The famous example is this goes back to the printing press. People start printing books. Many more books become available, and you see the intellectual powers that be worry that you essentially have misinformation. There's some really funny comments that you can go back and find in the wake of Gutenberg's invention, where people essentially say there's all sorts of false and faulty information coming from these new books being printed, and therefore we must suppress the technology. We must regulate the technology. We have to stop this from happening. And then, of course, I think in retrospect, we look at the history of the thing and we find out that actually it was the profusion of information and the profusion of knowledge, which was unprecedented in history to that point, turned out to be a boon for humanity. We gained much more knowledge. And in the wake of this expansion of knowledge and the expansion of literacy that came with it, we see also the expansion of religious liberty. We see the expansion of political liberty. We see the expansion of economic liberty, the rise of classical liberalism. And those things, I think, have unequivocally benefited society. In the larger context, though, why shouldn't the government involve itself in these sorts of things? Well, it turns out that governments are very slow and unresponsive, and they tend to regulation tends to be a blunt force object to deal with problems. And so the best way for arguments to be resolved is for the people who advance either side of a given question to fight it out, to make their best case, to advance their logic, to submit facts to the candid world, if you will. And when governments tend to get involved in these sorts of things, they simply get things wrong. They seem, from the historical record, to be unable to effectively arbitrate speech debates. It would make life a lot simpler in many ways if governing was an easier activity. If in every case regulators could involve themselves and make the right call, have a full understanding of the causes of whatever problems they're trying to solve, have a full understanding of the consequences of their proposed regulation, then there would be many problems that we could simply solve. But again, that's not the world we live in. There's a line in Aristotle where he essentially says that whatever the government does not permit, it forbids. And that goes back to Aristotle's notion of what the polis, what the political community is, which is something that is somewhat totalitarian in nature, and that everything is within the state, nothing is outside the state, and the government's reach expands everywhere. And its primary purpose is to inculcate virtue and to make people believe the right sorts of things and behave in the right sorts of ways. And those are all very noble goals, because I think everybody wants people to be good and people to believe the right things and act in the right ways. But again, when we look at the sweep of history, it turns out that this sort of government is doomed to failure. And the result is not some utopian community. The result is a lot of mistakes and a lot of missteps by the government and an authoritarian system.
That's a very important point you make, and that is the government. You're not talking about an individual. When we talk about authoritarians, we oftentimes think of a charismatic, evil type of person. People's from the Third Reich to communist China to whatever. But really, you're talking about these nameless, faceless entities in governments, and it's any government, and it's any organization. They exist because they want order, and the kind of order that they want in the populace, and to do that you need power. So those are just, it doesn't matter the system, it's still the system itself wants all of those things to achieve those things. I'm going to go back to this to the DSA and talk specifically about it with some details, and then I'm going to ask for your comments. The DSA is the European Union. The European Union is this federation of states on the European continent to basically be this one thing to sort of compete economically with America and China and Russia. So you have the European Union now. It's adopting these various laws to cut across borders in Europe. And that's if they were just governing for Europe. But going back to what you just said, once you have this thing, this entity, this EU, it wants better control over its people so that it can enact all the other policies that it wants to enact and achieve this utopia that you mentioned. That's kind of how it's structured. Now you have the individual people involved, and they look at their various strategies and ways to achieve all of that. And that's where we get into details. And it's also where we get into certain legislation like the DSA. So the DSA comes along and they basically say, here's this act we can have, and we can institute it. And in that way, we can ensure that only the kind of speech we like in Europe is online, on Facebook, on Twitter, X platform, on Instagram, all these various platforms. We can institute a law that ensures that it meets our expectations. Now, over on the sideline, you have the traditional media kind of cheering it on, because if anything screwed up the economics for traditional newspapers and traditional TV networks, it was the internet and people being able to get access to live video from Ukraine in the middle of a war without having to get it from a news organization. So they now like this idea of regulation and pulling things back so that certain speech can be regulated in some ways. So that's the incentive. That's all of the stuff. And so the DSA says, and here's the thing that I wanted to ask you about first. One of the commissioners over there behind the DSA said the EU said it does not regulate speech. So this whole DSA does not regulate speech, that the EU is committed to protecting and promoting free speech. And my question is, how can they institute something that clearly is a regulation for speech and say at the same time it doesn't regulate speech?
Again, it goes back to the question of what free speech actually is. And I think in Europe they do have on the whole they have good intentions, and they'll look at certain types of speech, and they'll say, all right, this seems to be hurting somebody, and so therefore we should probably discourage it. But of course, that assumption has many other assumptions baked into it. For example, is this speech really hurting someone, or is it simply making them uncomfortable? This of course, I think has parallels to many of the debates that we've had over misinformation and disinformation in the United States, and over hate speech as well. The fact is, if a government can look at something and say this is a misleading statement, and therefore we should pressure online platforms to disfavor it or to suppress it. The question, of course, becomes: is the government right or is the government wrong? And I think in the last few years, we've seen that very often when the government makes these sorts of calls, it actually gets them wrong. Of course, the most prominent example probably being the lab leak hypothesis about the origins of COVID. That went from the essence of misinformation to a very possible, if not probable, if not more likely than not, theory about how COVID began. Again, it sort of, the European posture towards free speech seems to be, okay, we're going to say we're protecting free speech, but if we don't like your the content of your speech, you don't really have the right to say it. So we're not really infringing upon free speech if we take steps to limit your ability to say it or to say it online. And again, this goes back to the capacity of the government to arbitrate these sorts of disputes. And the fact is, the government, as I've said, keeps getting things wrong. But I think it goes further than that, because what the European Union does not understand is that when the government controls speech, that has an effect on the people who are controlled. I think a very fundamental part of the human experience is to be able to educate oneself, to think through issues, to make judgments, to make assessments of fact, to make risk assessments, to make value judgments, all of this kind of thing. But that requires some sort of latitude for the individual to think through issues on his or her own without being told what to think. And one of the great things about Americans, I think, is as a people, the sort of the character of what the American experience, the American spirit is very independent. It's very individualistic in the best of senses. It's very driven to do things that others either haven't done or maybe that others disapprove of. And we've gotten a lot of benefits as a country from having that character as a people, but also we as individuals have found a lot of benefit in being able to exercise that capacity. And this is sort of the kind of thing that you would call like a free conscience, right? To make these to do these very human activities of exercising our reason. And so when you start to look at the all too well-intentioned efforts of the Europeans, they say we're not really doing anything about free speech. But on the other hand, they get things wrong, and they are changing the way that people think by attempting to impose controls from the top.
That's so true. Getting into the specifics, and this also follows on what you just said. So Articles 34 and 35 of the DSA basically have language in them that says that it will impose broad but ill-defined, this isn't the wording of it, I'm just summarizing my perspective on it, that the DSA imposes broad but ill-defined obligations to moderate content and identify, assess, and mitigate, now this is their words, systemic risks. So it's not just illegal content, as you mentioned earlier, it's content that they see as a threat. That's the word they used. A content that is a threat to civil discourse, electoral processes, and public health. You just mentioned the Wuhan thing. So they picked 3 really hot button issues to illustrate why they're doing this. And all 3 of them, if you're an American who really believes in free speech, can look at those same examples. They're using it as justification for the DSA. And most Americans who are really big First Amendment proponents would say those very issues are the reasons why you should not have the DSA. You should not have the DSA dictating what people can say about electoral processes or what they cannot say, or you should not have people who decide what is civil discourse and what isn't, and the other one is public health. It's like, well, that's a time we learned in COVID where we should be allowed to speak up and debate everything that the government's telling us about this, because the government doesn't get everything right. And not everybody gets everything right. And you can only kind of collectively find out what's right and what's wrong if you're allowed to discuss it, debate it, argue about it, and air points of view on it. So how do you look at that when you look at their language and they say, this is why we need the DSA, because we need to avoid any threat to the civil discourse?
So you've hit on something incredibly important with this point about the vagueness of the legalese. There's no clear standard for how the DSA will be implemented. The terms are far too broad, and frankly, there's far too much online speech to be able to apply very clear rules. And also, just sort of from the nature of speech, it's very difficult to draw distinctions between this exact wording is permissible, this exact wording isn't permissible, because there's so many elements of making a statement, from tone to context, to the events that are triggering your speech, etc., to make very clear definitions about, to draw very clear lines that would provide people with a known objective standard of what's permitted and what's not permitted. So the upshot of all of this is that enforcement becomes an incredibly arbitrary and discretionary process, where regulators essentially get to parachute in certain cases that they find to be particularly objectionable, and then enforce against that sort of speech. This is in no way a consistent standard that can be applied, and moreover, with respect to some of the public health debates, and this really extends to all public policy debates. Not only is the government imperfect at knowing the truth and conveying the truth to the citizenry at all times, but oftentimes facts change. Facts are inconclusive. I have all sorts of things that I believe, and some of them I believe with near 100% certainty, but there's some that I believe with 75 or 80% certainty based off of my best assessment of the information that I have. And there's no line in any of these regulations that can say, if governments are at least 80% sure that X, Y, or Z truth claim is correct, they can enforce against dissenters. That's simply not how this works. Because again, the lines that could be drawn to separate these sorts of things are just far too nebulous. And again, the upshot isn't anything approaching the rule of law, in which you can have consistent standards that individuals can work within, even if I might think that those standards are too tightly drawn. The end result is clearly that the government gets to intervene against the sorts of speech that offend its particular biases in the moment, based off of political pressures, fast developing circumstances, and other variables that are anything but objective.
I think the vagueness is the point of these of the language, and you just mentioned the term very quickly. You used the term "in the moment," and I think that's I made a note in some of my reading on this. The lack of a standard is the standard. And what I meant by that when I wrote it in my notes was, you basically have this vague language to be determined, basically, what is hate speech, what is misinformation, what is whatever, what is a threat to civil discourse. It's not defined because they want the luxury to be to define it after the fact, when they can police or enforce something on somebody. So basically, if I like you and you say something that I don't particularly approve of, but I like you, I'll let that go. And the law allows me to let that go. But if I find you as in the opposition party or in the opposition movement, and you say something that I can get you on, then I can reinterpret what defines hate speech according to the circumstances after you've said it, after you've put that post up online, after you've done something online. I can then determine that doesn't meet, that could be a threat to civil discourse. And so I have plenty of latitude in this law, because there is a lack of standard, to use the law for my own purposes. And it seems to me that that's the whole intent here. And I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's sort of this systemic movement where the people in charge want to do things a certain way. They create the government they want. They create the laws they want that work for them. And that's how they're kind of proceeding on this. And I wanted to ask you about that, but then I wanted to ask you about the American ripple to this whole thing. So how do you look at that when I say that the lack of a standard is the standard, and it's the intent? Well,
I think you're definitely correct in that assessment. And to a certain extent, it's worse than that, though. I also agree that it is not necessarily a conspiracy, but again, due to the sort of nebulous nature of the line drawing exercise with respect to speech, you need to give regulators, you need to give bureaucrats and law enforcement very wide latitude, so that you're able to enforce against the things that you find objectionable, again, in the moment. But the part where it's worse than that is that these sorts of vague standards scare digital platforms into over suppressing speech. Companies are risk averse. They are litigation averse. They are going to attempt to avoid uncomfortable interactions with the government, and they're going to attempt to avoid the sorts of financial and legal costs that come with enforcement actions. So the result of all of this, and we've seen this in many contexts online with platforms, is that they just over suppress things. They stifle anything that could seem to potentially attract the scrutiny of regulators. And so the end game, I guess I should say, whether or not this is conscious on the part of the lawmakers, is that even without any sort of direct interference or direct enforcement of the law, you have a digital ecosystem in which the free flow of information and the free flow of knowledge and the swapping of opinions has been suppressed by companies that are simply trying to avoid legal costs and legal action.
That's so true. And that does get to the question I wanted to ask you about America, because you have these big giants that are based in America, the Meta, Facebook, X, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, all these different social media sites. You have all of those based in America. And when you read about how they moderate and they set their algorithms for content moderation, it's pretty much a global standard. And they go to the lowest common denominator. So if Europe is the most strict on what they accept on online speech, then they set their algorithms right there. So if you happen to be somebody in Cleveland, Ohio, and you're posting about something that someone in Europe might find objectionable, the algorithm on that platform will censor you because it's set that way to meet those European standards. And since the internet is global, somebody in the UK could read what you wrote in Cleveland. So the justification is, well, we set one standard and it's basically going to the European standard right now. And that's why you can't say that in Cleveland, Ohio, online. And you spread that out and you multiply it by millions of posts every day. And you basically have an American media or an American social media platform that is self-policing, as you just said, to adhere to a standard. And it has the effect of censoring Americans online. So is that a stretch, or am I over exaggerating it, or is that something that is going to happen?
So I would actually quibble with that to a certain extent. Social media platforms and other tech services work differently in different countries. And so with regulations like the DSA or Europe's Artificial Intelligence Act, the Europeans are really impoverishing the internet for their own users. In another case, the AI Act has caused delays in the rollout of features like Apple Intelligence to European users. The real problem that I see for Americans is that American lawmakers are seeking to bring the DSA stateside. There have been laws known as age-appropriate design codes passed in California, passed in Vermont, and I believe a couple of other states that were largely written or based off of concepts designed by the Europeans. There's a bill called the Kids Online Safety Act, which has gotten quite a lot of traction in Congress, which bears many similarities, almost provision by provision in certain circumstances, to the DSA. And again, this goes back to the notion that the internet is just too dangerous to be left unregulated, that there's simply too much speech happening outside of the control of the state for the internet to be socially useful. And the upshot of this is that we are seeing right now that Europe has a speech problem, and they have a lot of problems also with many of their other digital regulations, from civil liberties perspectives, from the economics perspective, et cetera. And Americans have taken notice, and I mean, even President Trump has taken notice, and he's pushing back against some of the economic regulations, such as the Digital Markets Act, that are targeting American companies, and trying to push back against some of the ways in which that will have spillover effects for Americans and the American economy and for the American tech sector and innovation. However, there's still, because of this fear about the internet and the free flow of information that it has enabled, there's still the desire to import DSA-like regulations to the United States. There's a disconnect. There's a lack of understanding that if we import in certain styles of European regulation, we will get some of the same outcomes, some of the same political and social outcomes that Europe is experiencing and that we abhor. You can't simply say that we're going to do the same things that Europe is doing, but we are somehow better, and so we will not see the same consequences and not face the same results.
It's interesting. I read something recently, and this was an American pundit and researcher, somebody who's highly respected, who worked in the intelligence community himself over the years. And his theory about the DSA is that it was actually originated in the United States. Even though it's a European thing, his thinking was that it was crafted, drafted, and exported over to Europe because our First Amendment would not allow that here. And it's sort of in basketball, they call it a bank shot when you bank it off the backboard and it goes into the hoop. Basically, this is a big bank shot where you shoot it over to Europe, you get it enacted in Europe, you make it a part of a way of life in Europe and on the internet, and then you find ways to bring it back in ways that it doesn't violate at least the front door of the First Amendment, and it sort of comes in the back door. And that was his theory, that there are people that he feels were involved with the crafting of the DSA, and it was instituted now in Europe, and it now will be sort of like an off-Broadway approach. It will be tested in Europe, and it will be refined, and it will come back to the United States in some form. And at the end of the day, there will be more censorship in the United States. That was his fear. That's not something I'm trying to say as an alarmist, but I think there was something that you and I talked about before the interview, and you wanted to mention it, and I think it applies here too. In an article that you wrote a couple years back as a journalist, you talked about the DSA and how it aimed to create a safer internet by introducing transparency requirements and other accountability measures for platforms. So you do have some thoughts on those transparency requirements. What are they?
Well, I think one of the backdoor mechanisms that you mentioned are these transparency requirements, which again are seen in the DSA, but also we've seen them in things like the age-appropriate design codes that I mentioned a second ago. The idea that sort of just mandating radical transparency has no I guess coercive effect on the speech that goes on social media platforms is quite dubious. First off, transparency requirements have problems for the security of, or I should say that the privacy of companies with respect to proprietary information about how they operate. It has dangers for the privacy of individuals. There's a lot of talk about how you can anonymize online data and start sharing it around, but then it turns out with the tools of the internet, it's very easy in most cases to de-anonymize data and then trace information back to individuals. But also sort of when you set standards and you say that online platforms have to be completely forthcoming about everything they're doing, that has an effect of nudging the platforms towards tailoring their actual conduct to the standards that regulators favor. There's, again, to go back to the founders, James Madison has a wonderful quote where he says, an advisory government is a contradiction in terms. There's something coercive about government activity inherently. And that's not necessarily a bad thing per se, because again, the whole point of the government is that it's the central authority that has the power of law enforcement. It has the guns, it has the famous monopoly on force. And that's necessary for a certain amount of stability. But at the same time, that makes overextensions of government power, even with seemingly benign things like transparency, very ill-advised in many cases. And again, I think there are all sorts of ways of framing online regulations to seem as if they are entirely benign. It's just about sharing information. It's just about transparency, providing more knowledge to users, to outside academics. to the government, et cetera, that have the effect in practice of shaping the way that content is moderated online and shaping the way in which speech happens online. And then once we're at that point, we are back to the dangers of the government interfering with people's right to think and speak and argue freely.
That's an excellent way to summarize it. I just have one more question for you, and it's really, you mentioned the government being in an advisory position. I'm asking you to take an advisory position now for the American internet user. How should they look at this DSA development? And is there anything that they can do as part of this democracy to help keep it from spreading in a way that's unintentional for the United States?
Simply put, hold the line. Many of the types of interferences of government in American life and the American economy were rolled back by the advent of the internet. The digital world, if I can use a phrase that I criticized earlier in this interview, is much freer because it's newer, and to a large extent, until recently, the government hadn't gotten around to regulating it in the same way and to the same extent as the offline world. And that is a great benefit to individuals and a great benefit to society. It's this zone of freedom in which people can act as they choose, and I think we've really reaped the benefits of that in all sorts of ways. But the danger of the internet is that it presents many new and unprecedented opportunities for the government to involve itself in the individual lives of people. If you're having a conversation with a friend at a bar or across a living room, or driving down the street in a vehicle, there's very few ways for the government to know what's going on. When information is going over a digital network, on the other hand, snooping is much more possible. Snooping is also just much less invasive. If the government were to put a microphone in everybody's car or in everybody's living room, we would see that as jackboot authoritarianism, big brotherism, call it what you will. And I don't think that sort of thing would last very long. But when the government intrudes on online speech, or when it intrudes into the digital privacy of citizens, it's much less obvious, it's much less tangible. And so we need to be even more on our guard against the creeping desire to control and to regulate and to get the government intertwined in the private decision-making and the private lives of American citizens.
Well said. David McGarry, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
The Shaping Opinion Podcast is a production of O'Brien Communications. Copyright O'Brien Communications 2025. Find us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you like to watch, go to YouTube, Rumble, or our Substack page, shapingopinion.com.